Cynthia was screaming my name through the storm like I somehow controlled the sky. Her voice tore through the wind, sharp and accusing, as if the rain itself answered to me. Then, right in front of all of us, a violent surge of muddy water slammed into the HOA office doors. The glass shattered inward, and the entire front lobby vanished under a rushing wave. In that instant, while alarms blared and papers spun like leaves in a tornado, all the warnings I had given them, every single one of them, came roaring back into my mind. I stood there in the cold downpour, soaked to the bone, watching the place that had caused me months of stress and retaliation get swallowed. The air smelled of wet drywall and muddy earth, and every gust of wind stung my face like needles. Firefighters were struggling to keep their footing as the water pushed against their boots, but Cynthia wasn't calling out to help them. She wasn't even trying to help anyone else. She was screaming at me, pointing at me, like I had orchestrated a natural disaster just to prove a point. "Mark, this is your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking between the rolling thunder. "You caused this. You did this." I didn't respond. I just held my phone steady, filming everything, because deep down I knew this moment was bigger than me, bigger than her anger, bigger than the building filling with water. This was the proof I had been waiting for. The proof they had ignored every warning, every email, every meeting where I tried to get them to listen. The cameras caught everything. The water line rising inside the office, the soaked stacks of files floating to the surface, the panicked board members shouting useless commands, and Cynthia's face twisted in rage as she tried to convince everyone I was to blame. The firefighters pushed past her, one of them shouting that the drainage system had completely failed, and the overflow was coming straight from the main community line. I heard one of them say it should have been inspected months ago. Months ago. Exactly when I first reported it. As I stood there, I felt the weight of the cold rain mixed with something else. Vindication, but also disbelief. I had predicted this exact scenario, almost word for word, yet when I tried to warn them, they brushed me off like I was some bored neighbor with nothing better to do. And now, watching mud fill the office where they had signed those violation notices, where they had laughed off my concerns, where Cynthia had once told me to stop imagining problems, I realized this moment didn't start with the storm. It started the day I moved to Maple Ridge. The wind howled and the water kept rising, but my mind drifted back to that first morning in the neighborhood, the welcome packet, the fresh-cut lawns, the strange puddle I stepped over without thinking. I didn't know then that the smallest details would become the biggest warning signs. I didn't know that Cynthia's first words to me would foreshadow months of hostility. And I definitely didn't know that a simple drainage issue would turn into a full-scale disaster. Standing there in the storm, watching everything fall apart, I finally understood something. This flood didn't just expose the drainage problem. It exposed the truth behind every decision Cynthia had made. And if you want to know why she was screaming my name in front of the whole neighborhood, you need to hear how this nightmare started. Cynthia didn't greet me with a welcome. She greeted me with orders. And that was the moment I should have realized what kind of leader she was. But back then, I was just excited to finally move into a quiet, neatly trimmed neighborhood where I thought my wife and I could breathe a little easier. I'd spent months working overtime to afford this place, imagining slow mornings, peaceful evenings, and neighbors who waved instead of watched. Maple Ridge seemed perfect, almost like something out of a real estate commercial. Neighborhood kids riding bikes, lawns cut to identical lengths, every house painted in soft earth tones that seemed coordinated on purpose. I should have known then that perfection usually has a price. The moving truck had barely rolled to a stop when I heard heels clicking sharply behind me. I turned to see a woman in a fitted blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm, her expression tight enough to crack. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't even ask my name. "You can't park there," she snapped, pointing at the moving truck like it offended her personally. "Delivery vehicles must remain on the right side of the street. It's in the handbook." I remember blinking, waiting for her to soften, to at least pretend she cared that a new homeowner just arrived. But she didn't. She just stared at me, waiting for me to move the truck. That was my introduction to Cynthia Blake, the woman who would eventually turn my life into a waking nightmare. When I stepped inside my new house later that afternoon, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Maybe she meant well but didn't know how to express it. Everyone has flaws, right? But as I carried boxes back and forth, I noticed something unsettling. The neighbors didn't just greet Cynthia, they avoided her. Whenever she walked by, conversations died mid-sentence. People stood straighter, adjusted their mailbox flags, or rushed inside like they suddenly remembered something important. I'd never seen fear disguised as politeness so clearly before. It wasn't until the sun began to set that I noticed the first strange detail, just a small puddle collecting near the walkway that led to the HOA office. It hadn't rained that day, not even a drizzle, yet there it was. A dark circle of water quietly gathering where it shouldn't be. I stepped over it without thinking, assuming maybe someone watered the plants earlier or a sprinkler misfired. Later, that evening, as I chatted with my neighbor Tom while unloading the last few boxes, he nodded towards Cynthia, who was patrolling the street with the same clipboard from earlier. "She keeps the place tight," he whispered. "Too tight, if you ask me." I laughed it off. "She seemed firm." Tom snorted. "Firm is one word. Controlling is another. Just don't correct her on anything. She doesn't like that." It felt like a strange warning, the kind people give you before a storm, but I brushed it aside. After all, it was just an HOA president doing her job. Or so I thought. The puddle near the walkway didn't cross my mind again for the rest of the night. It was such a tiny, harmless thing, too small to matter. But looking back now, I can see how that single puddle was the first whisper of the disaster waiting underneath our perfect neighborhood. If I'd paid attention to that tiny puddle, maybe I'd have seen the disaster coming. The drain didn't overflow. It exploded upward like something alive was trapped underneath. One second it was just a quiet curb inlet. The next it sent a burst of filthy water straight into the air, splashing my shoes and soaking my jeans. That's when I knew something was very wrong. A simple neighborhood drain shouldn't behave like a geyser unless it's begging for help. It was a light rain that afternoon, nothing heavy enough to cause problems anywhere else in the neighborhood. But Maple Ridge had a strange way of hiding its flaws until they became too big to ignore. I had been unpacking in the garage when I heard the sudden gurgling outside. At first I thought it was just regular runoff, but when I stepped closer, the drain coughed again. Loud, deep, almost like a swallowed breath. Then it shot another spray of cloudy water upward, mixing with the rain and pooling around my feet. My engineering instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't a simple clog. This was a sign of an undersized or neglected system. Something that couldn't handle even moderate flow. Water should have been rushing down into the drain, not erupting out of it like a malfunctioning fountain. And worse, the water wasn't spreading out evenly across the street. It was sliding downhill, forming a clear path straight toward the walkway leading to the HOA office. Even with the rain still gentle, the current was unmistakable. The water was traveling the wrong way. I pulled out my phone and took a quick video. I wasn't thinking about proving anything at the time. It was just instinct to capture something so odd. After watching the drain spit water a third time, I walked back inside, dried off, and told myself it was probably nothing serious. But something about the force of that surge stayed with me. So I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a simple, polite email to the HOA. I introduced myself, mentioned I was new to Maple Ridge, and described what I witnessed. I even softened my wording, saying things like "just noticed" and "might need a quick check," to make sure they didn't think I was criticizing anyone. I attached the short video and wrote that it would be wise to have someone inspect the drain before we got heavier rain. Within an hour, I received a reply, one that made it clear they didn't care. "Thank you for your message. Water pooling during rainfall is normal in this area. The drainage system is fully adequate. No action required at this time." That was it. No follow-up questions, no acknowledgement of the video, not even a promise to check it out. Just a dismissive brush off. I remember staring at the email and wondering if they even watched the video, because anyone with eyes would have seen something was obviously wrong. Later that evening, while walking my dog, I mentioned the drain to my neighbor Tom. He let out a tired laugh and shook his head. "Oh, that thing's been a problem for years," he said. "We've complained, but Cynthia doesn't like fixing things unless she can take credit for them." Another neighbor overheard and chimed in quietly. "Last time someone brought it up, they got hit with 3 violations in a week." I didn't think much of that comment then. I should have. Because the next morning, as I reread the HOA's dismissive reply, something in my gut told me I had stepped onto a path Cynthia didn't want anyone walking. That single email was enough for the HOA to quietly put a target on my back. The violation letter wasn't about cleanliness. It was a warning shot. And it told me my real crime was speaking up. It arrived just 3 days after I emailed the HOA about the drain. I remember finding the notice stuck crookedly to my front door, flapping in the wind like it was proud of itself. The bold print at the top read "Immediate action required," and for a second, my stomach tightened. I wondered if something serious had happened, until I read the actual reason. Trash can visible from the street. That was it. Not overflowing, not blocking the sidewalk. Just visible. The ironic thing was, half the street's trash cans were visible on pickup days, but mine was the only one that apparently qualified as a community emergency. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the notice, feeling the truth settle into place. This wasn't about rules. This was retaliation. Still, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was a coincidence, that maybe the inspector just happened to walk by. But something in me already knew better. And that gut feeling only strengthened when I decided to attend my first HOA board meeting the following week. The meeting room inside the clubhouse felt smaller than it looked. Rows of folding chairs lined up in front of a long table where Cynthia sat dead center, flanked by 2 board members who looked more like her personal guards than volunteers. The second I walked in, her eyes locked onto mine. Sharp, cold, calculating. It was the kind of look someone gives when they're already preparing a counterattack. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I raised my hand and stood. I explained the drain issue calmly, described what I'd witnessed, and mentioned the video I'd shared in my email. The room was quiet, a few residents nodding because they'd seen the same water pooling for years. But before I could finish, Cynthia leaned forward, clasping her hands like I was a student wasting her time. "Mark," she said loudly, "we reviewed your email. The board found no evidence of system failure. Water on the street is completely normal. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with our community's design, but everything is functioning exactly as intended." A few people glanced at me with sympathy, but Cynthia wasn't finished. "And please," she added, raising her voice a little, "let's avoid dramatic exaggerations. We can't spend board time on imaginary problems." Imaginary. She used that word like a blade. The board members nodded along immediately, not even pretending to think for themselves. I knew they hadn't investigated anything. They didn't ask to see the video. They didn't ask for details. They just backed her because that's what they always did. When the meeting ended, I walked out quietly, but my anger simmered beneath the surface. I didn't want a conflict. I didn't want a feud. I just wanted them to acknowledge a real safety issue. That's all. But the HOA had decided I was trouble, and they made sure I knew it. The next morning, another violation notice appeared on my door. This time it claimed my grass was slightly above the approved height. I measured it myself. It wasn't. Not even close. But the message was clear. Speak up again, and the punishments get worse. As I stood there holding the second violation, feeling that familiar frustration boil in my chest, something in me shifted. If they were willing to fabricate violations, then this wasn't just about a drain. This was about power, and about punishing anyone who dared to question it. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to back down. I was going to document everything. If they wanted a quiet troublemaker, they picked the wrong homeowner. Water was climbing the curb again, inch by inch. I recorded everything and begged them to act. Their answer? A fresh violation taped to my door. That moment, standing there with rain dripping from my jacket and the camera still warm in my hand, was when I realized the HOA wasn't just ignoring me. They were punishing me for noticing the truth. It started with another moderate rainfall, the kind that shouldn't have caused more than a few puddles on the sidewalks. But there I was again, standing at the bottom of the street, watching the community drain choke on the runoff like it was swallowing gravel. The water didn't flow into it. It surged backward in erratic bursts, spitting debris and dark sludge across the asphalt. I held my phone steady and filmed everything. The gurgling, the sudden eruptions, the water pushing up instead of down. It wasn't just malfunctioning, it was failing exactly the same way it had weeks before. I zoomed in on the water creeping toward the walkway leading to the HOA office, remembering how the last rainfall formed the same pattern. I'd spent years working on construction sites. I knew what improper grading and block drainage looked like. But this wasn't just a maintenance issue. It was a predictable disaster waiting to happen. Once I got home, I sat at my dining table, still wet from the rain, and wrote another email to the HOA. This time, I wasn't soft. I was professional, factual, and thorough. I cited the exact times the flooding started. I included photos with timestamps. I attached the video footage. I laid out the possible risks if the issue escalated during a major storm, which we were due for in the upcoming season. I hit send and waited, hoping that maybe this time the evidence would push them into action. Cynthia responded 2 hours later. Your observations are noted, but you appear to be misinterpreting normal street runoff. Please refrain from exaggerating routine weather conditions. The board has determined no further steps are necessary. Exaggerating. She used that word like a dismissal, like I was making up a fictional threat for attention. I read her email 3 times, each time feeling my frustration deepen. She hadn't watched the video. She hadn't looked at the photos. She didn't care about the facts. She cared about control. And just like clockwork, the retaliation came. 3 new violations in a single week. 1 for a garden hose left uncoiled. 1 for unapproved holiday decor, even though it was a plain wreath. And the last, the one that made my wife's voice break in anger, accused us of maintaining an unclean property because a leaf pile had gathered near the corner of our yard after the rain. That was the moment I knew I needed to stop playing defense. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it Maple Ridge Evidence. Every video, every email, every violation letter, every timestamp. I downloaded weather logs from the county's website and matched them to the exact dates of the minor floods. I even printed copies because something in my gut told me that documentation would become my only shield. While digging through state HOA regulations, I discovered something Cynthia surely hoped I'd never find. The HOA was legally responsible for maintaining all common drainage systems. The very drain they kept dismissing was, by law, their obligation. Not mine, not my neighbors, theirs. If that drain failed, if property was damaged, if flooding occurred, responsibility landed squarely on their shoulders. No amount of violation letters could change that. And just as I was organizing everything into neat, labeled folders, the news report came on. A storm system, stronger, colder, and wetter than anything we'd seen in years, was heading straight for our county. Then the weather report dropped, and the nightmare officially had a date. The news warned of record-breaking rainfall. Cynthia told everyone it was exaggerated drama. One of them was catastrophically wrong, and as the meteorologist's grim tone filled my living room that evening, I knew exactly who it would be. I sat on the edge of my couch, remote in hand, watching the weather map glow red and purple, colors you never want to see on a storm forecast. The reporter spoke of a slow-moving system drifting straight toward our county, carrying more water than anything we'd seen in over a decade. Flood advisories were already being issued in neighboring towns. Roads were expected to wash out. Storm drains were predicted to back up across the state. I didn't need the news to tell me what that meant for Maple Ridge. I'd already run the numbers myself. As soon as the broadcast ended, I grabbed a notepad from the kitchen counter and sketched the slope of our street, the angle of runoff, the direction of flow. The community drain sat at the exact low point, and with its current condition, there was no chance it would survive a storm like the one heading our way. It hadn't handled a mild drizzle. How was it going to manage 6 to 8 inches of rain? I recorded another short video of the drain, this time explaining the expected runoff based on the storm paths. Then, with my jaw clenched, I opened my laptop and drafted one last email to the HOA. This time, I didn't soften anything. I wrote plainly, detailing the imminent risk of flooding, the likely failure of the drainage system, and the potential property damage if they refused to act. I ended it with, "Please take immediate measures to inspect and clear the drain before the incoming storm. This is a serious safety concern." I hit send. Her response came 20 minutes later. "Mark, your constant dramatic warnings are creating unnecessary fear in the community. Please refrain from spreading panic. The board has reviewed your previous emails and determined the drainage system is fully sufficient. Any further messages of this nature may be considered disruptive and in violation of community guidelines." Fear-mongering, disruptive, violations. That's what she called trying to prevent a disaster. I sat there staring at her email, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Cynthia didn't just refuse to listen. She refused to let anyone else listen. She made it clear that acknowledging the truth was more dangerous to her pride than a literal flood. Fine. If the HOA wouldn't prepare, I would. The next morning, I drove to 3 different hardware stores before I finally found a stack of sandbags. I loaded them into my truck, along with a portable pump, heavy-duty tarps, and spare batteries. When I arrived home and started lining the sandbags around the lowest point of my driveway, neighbors walking their dogs slowed down and stared. Some gave me silent nods of support. Others looked nervous, clearly aware of the storm updates, but unwilling to go against Cynthia's official stance. By noon, I received yet another violation notice. Unapproved exterior items creating visual disruption. Visual disruption in the face of a historic storm. I folded the letter, placed it in my evidence folder, and kept working. Because at that point, I wasn't thinking about Cynthia's anger. I was thinking about the water line I'd seen climbing higher and higher with each rainfall. I was thinking about the uncomfortable truth that we were one storm away from a catastrophe the HOA refused to acknowledge. As the sky darkened later that evening, a heavy silence settled over the neighborhood. The first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon. I stood on my porch, watching the trees shiver in the rising wind, and I felt the same weight settle in my chest, the same sense of inevitability. The storm hadn't even peaked when I realized the drain was dead. I heard the drain before I saw it. It groaned like metal twisting apart under pressure, and then it went silent, and that silence terrified me. A working drain never goes silent during a storm like this. Silence meant it wasn't draining anything anymore. Silence meant death. The storm had arrived with no hesitation. Rain hammered the rooftops hard enough to rattle my windows, and the wind pushed sheets of water across the street in thick, rippling waves. Within minutes, the gutters couldn't keep up. Water gushed out of them in messy arcs, pooling on the pavement before racing downhill as if the entire neighborhood had tilted overnight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto my front porch, the air cold and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The beam of my light cut through the rain just enough for me to see the main drain up the street, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It wasn't draining anything. Instead, water was surging from its edges, bubbling up like a boiling pot. The drain was backing up instantly, unable to swallow even a fraction of what was pouring into it. Just as I lifted my phone to record, the drain let out one final, violent choke, a deep, hollow sound, and then erupted. A fountain of muddy water burst upward, splashing across the street and carrying leaves, twigs, and debris with it. My hands shook as I filmed, not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that this was the moment I'd been trying to stop for months. I panned my camera across the street, capturing the river that had formed in seconds. The rain didn't fall. It attacked. It pounded the pavement so forcefully that the water seemed to leap upward before it could settle. Inside my house, the lights flickered once. Then again. The second time, they stayed dim for a few seconds, humming low like the whole electrical system was struggling to breathe. My wife called out from the hallway, asking if everything was okay, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the scene outside. I told her to stay inside and keep the kids calm, but even my own voice trembled. The street wasn't a street anymore. It had transformed into a full-blown water channel, a fast-moving current that dragged branches and trash cans along with it. The water didn't spread evenly. It followed a single unmistakable path downhill, the exact path I had mapped out on my notepad days earlier. And that path led straight to the HOA office. I stepped further into the storm, letting the rain pelt my hood and the wind shove against my chest. I needed a clear view of where the water was going. The channel grew wider every minute. The current quickened. The drain behind me was long gone, drowned under a sheet of brown, swirling runoff. And as I followed the flow, I watched it speed toward the office building like it had a destination, like the storm itself was making a point. The HOA office lights flickered just like my house had. For a moment, I could see silhouettes moving inside, board members trying to gather files, computers, anything they thought they could save. Their shadows moved frantically across the wet glass. Then I saw something that made my breath catch. The water jumped the curb in front of the office. Not poured, jumped. It hit the sidewalk, hesitated for a split second, and then surged forward with enough force to break through the mulch beds along the wall. I raised my phone again, the lens fogging instantly from the cold rain. I zoomed in. And then I saw the first wave slam against their doorway. The office doors didn't open. They collapsed inward. One violent wave slammed against them, shattering the glass like it was nothing more than brittle ice. And Cynthia arrived screaming like I had summoned the storm myself. Her voice cut through the chaos, sharp, angry, desperate, as if yelling my name could somehow stop the flood pouring into her precious kingdom. I stood at the edge of the parking lot, rain turning my clothes into a second skin, watching the water swallow the HOA office whole. The moment the doors gave way, muddy brown water rushed inside with the force of a truck. I could hear the crash even over the storm's roar, a sound thick with destruction. Papers flew off desks and spun in the air before melting into the rising, murky pool. A stack of binders drifted across the lobby like small, helpless boats. A printer toppled over, splashing violently as it disappeared under the sludge. The smell hit next. Wet drywall mixed with the sharp bite of electrical wiring overheating. Sparks crackled from somewhere inside, casting quick flashes of white light across the soaked carpeting. I watched chairs float toward the hallway as if being carried by a tide. Everything the HOA had stored, everything they guarded with threats and violations, was being dragged across the floor by the same water they insisted wasn't a problem. Then Cynthia's SUV screeched into the parking lot, slipping slightly on the flooding asphalt. She jumped out before the engine even shut off, heels sinking instantly into the cold water. She waded toward the chaos, her blazer soaked, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes burning with a mixture of fear and outrage. "This is your fault, Mark," she shouted, pointing at me with a shaking hand. "You caused this. You made this happen." I didn't move. I kept my camera steady, filming the destruction exactly as it unfolded. Her accusations didn't even sting anymore. They sounded absurd against the backdrop of the storm ripping her office apart. "I warned you," I called back, raising my voice just enough to be heard over the thunder. "I emailed you. I showed you videos. You ignored every single warning." "You're lying," she screamed, splashing toward the doorway as firefighters ran past her. "Stop recording. Stop it right now." A firefighter pushed gently but firmly past her. "Ma'am, step back. The entire drainage system has failed. We're assessing the structural integrity of the building." Failed. Hearing him say it out loud almost made me laugh. Not out of joy, but from the sheer disbelief that those words weren't coming from me for once. They came from a uniformed firefighter, his boots submerged halfway up his calves, his light reflecting off the flooded doorway. Cynthia spun toward him, desperate. It's not the system. Someone redirected the water. Someone caused this. But no one listened. Not the firefighters. Not the residents gathering behind me. Not even the board members inside the building who were frantically trying to grab what they could before abandoning the lobby to the flood. The storm had exposed everything. The neglected drain, the ignored warnings, the arrogance that kept her from admitting the truth. I kept filming, the lens fogging slightly as the cold rain hit it. Behind me, residents whispered. Some pointed. Some shook their heads. Everyone knew exactly what had happened. And just as firefighters pushed deeper into the dark, flooded lobby, Cynthia spun back to me, eyes wild with rage and desperation, as if blaming me was the only thing she had left. But Cynthia wasn't done. She was about to make me her public scapegoat. At 7 a.m. sharp, an email blasted through the entire neighborhood. They didn't imply I caused the flood. They stated it, bold and underlined. The subject line read, "Urgent Community Notice. Flooding incident caused by unauthorized homeowner modifications." And right beneath it, in the first paragraph, was my name. I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop. Texts from neighbors, missed calls, notifications. My stomach dropped when I opened the email. According to the HOA, I had intentionally redirected stormwater with unapproved sandbags, creating damaging runoff that overwhelmed the community drainage system. They claimed the flood was a direct result of reckless interference. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, stunned. Even for Cynthia, this was a new level of shamelessness. They weren't twisting facts anymore. They were fabricating an entire narrative from nothing. And they were doing it publicly, in writing, to the entire neighborhood. I sat up, opened my laptop, and clicked into the evidence folder I'd been building for weeks. Every photo, every video, every recorded surge, time-stamped and logged. Every email exchange with Cynthia, including the ones where she dismissed my warnings as exaggeration. I sent everything to my insurance adjuster in one organized bundle. If the HOA wanted to accuse me, they were about to learn what real documentation looked like. An hour later, I got a call from the adjuster. "Mark, I've reviewed your materials. Keep everything. Don't delete a single file. We'll be sending someone out today." By noon, a city inspector and a municipal water engineer were walking the street with clipboards and cameras. They didn't look confused. They didn't look uncertain. They looked irritated because they had already heard from other neighborhoods about similar drainage mismanagement during storms. They approached me first. "Are you the homeowner who reported drainage issues before the storm?" I nodded, multiple times. They exchanged a glance, like that confirmed something they already suspected. Then they walked toward the HOA office, where Cynthia and two board members were waiting as if they were about to give a tour. I followed at a distance, close enough to hear her voice. Cynthia put on her sweetest, fakest tone, the one she reserved for officials and potential buyers. "We never received any warnings," she said confidently. "Not a single one. This homeowner acted on his own, tampered with drainage patterns, and created unsafe conditions." The inspector didn't even respond. He simply opened his binder and flipped to a printed email. The first warning I'd sent, then another, then the video stills. All time-stamped, all verified. "I have these from Mr. Davis," he said calmly. "Sent weeks before the incident. Are you saying these were never received?" Cynthia's face cracked, just for a second, before she forced a smile. "Well, perhaps they were misplaced." Misplaced. Months of warnings, suddenly misplaced. I stepped forward and handed the inspector my folder. "Here are the originals. Email logs, delivery confirmations, videos, all backed up." Behind me, I heard neighbors murmur. Some gasped quietly. Others let out bitter laughs. The shift was happening. Finally. The truth was visible, undeniable. Undeniable even for those who had once defended the HOA blindly. As the officials walked the property, taking photos of the destroyed drain, the damaged trail, and the water channel marks carved into the street. A few neighbors approached me. Some apologized for believing the HOA's email. Others admitted they had seen the drain back up long before I ever moved in. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the pressure lift. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. The truth was on record now, and the HOA couldn't bury it. But Cynthia wasn't finished. Not even close. So the HOA decided to try one last attack. One designed to break me completely. The notice taped to my door wasn't a violation. It was a threat disguised as paperwork. The moment I saw the bold red letters stamped across the top, "Final Enforcement Action," I knew the HOA wasn't trying to intimidate me anymore. They were trying to break me, and they expected me to bow. I tore the notice off the door, my hands trembling, not from fear but from the sickening mix of anger and disbelief twisting in my chest. The letter accused me, officially and in writing, of intentionally redirecting stormwater in a manner that caused catastrophic community flooding. They claim my sandbags were unauthorized obstructions that forced runoff toward the HOA office, leading to irreversible property damage. Then came the threats: a fine of $5,000, daily penalties for continued noncompliance, and the worst of all, the HOA threatened to place a lien on my home. I stood in my driveway, holding that paper in the cold morning air, the memory of Cynthia's screams still echoing from the night the office flooded. I had expected retaliation. I had expected denial. But this was a calculated attempt to financially suffocate me, to turn the narrative into something legally dangerous. They wanted me scared, but fear wasn't what hit me. Resolve did. I walked inside, sat at my kitchen table, and without hesitating, searched for a property attorney. Within an hour, I was on a call, explaining everything, from the first failed drain to the fabricated violations to the flood that destroyed their office. I emailed him the full evidence folder I'd built over the past weeks. The call went silent for a moment as he reviewed it, and then he said something I'll never forget. "Mark, you've documented this like a professional investigator. This isn't just negligence. This is retaliation. And retaliation by an HOA is a serious legal violation." For the first time, the weight on my chest loosened. We scheduled an in-person meeting for that afternoon. I brought every folder, every screenshot, every timestamp. The attorney examined each piece with a growing look of disbelief. When he read Cynthia's latest letter, he actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was blatantly flawed. "This isn't a legal notice," he said. "It's an intimidation tactic, and they just put their own negligence in writing." Within 2 days, he drafted a formal legal response. Calm, precise, razor sharp. It outlined every warning I had sent, every refusal from the HOA, and every instance where they failed to maintain the drainage system they were legally responsible for. It demanded the immediate withdrawal of all fines and violations, and it warned the HOA that pursuing further action against me could result in a counterclaim for damages, harassment, and bad faith governance. But I wasn't relying on a lawyer's letter alone. I wanted accountability, so I filed a complaint with the city's code enforcement office. Not a casual report, a full detailed account with supporting documentation. When they received everything, the response was immediate and direct. The city scheduled a full on-site drainage inspection. The moment I got that confirmation email, I felt the shift. Not victory, just the sense that the truth was finally standing beside me instead of behind me. That the next steps wouldn't rely on Cynthia's arrogance or the HOA's manipulation, but on facts, measurements, and professional evaluation. Inspection day came faster than I expected. The sky was still bruised from the storm, the asphalt stained with the memories of where the water had carved its path. I stepped outside my house just as the city truck pulled up. The inspector climbed out, camera in hand, clipboard tucked under his arm, and when the inspector stepped onto the property, Cynthia's expression changed instantly. The room erupted the moment the inspector spoke. People were shouting, demanding answers, and for the first time, Cynthia had nothing to say. All the control she'd clung to for months The authority, the arrogance, the rehearsed confidence fell apart right there in the HOA clubhouse as her own community turned against her. The emergency meeting was packed so tightly that neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Some still wore rain boots from the cleanup efforts. Others held folders, pictures, even broken items salvaged from the flood. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp clothes and frustration that had been simmering long before the storm hit. I took a seat near the front, my documents stacked neatly in my lap, my heartbeat steady for the first time in weeks. Cynthia sat at the center of the board table, a place she used to occupy with pride and intimidation. But now her posture was stiff, her face pale, her fingers tapping nervously on the wooden surface. She didn't have her usual stack of violation papers. She didn't have her polished smile. She didn't even have the board's support. They looked just as shaken as everyone else. The city inspector stepped forward, cleared his throat, and opened his report. That silence, the brief moment before he spoke, felt heavier than the floodwater that had swallowed the office. "We conducted a full inspection of the drainage system," he began, his voice firm and steady. "And based on the evidence, it is clear that the failure was not caused by homeowner interference. It was caused by prolonged neglect and lack of maintenance of the community's drainage structures." The room exploded. Neighbors stood up, yelling over one another. "So you're saying this could have been prevented? We paid dues for this. Why wasn't the drain maintained? Why did you blame Mark?" Cynthia tried to raise her hand, but the inspector continued, louder this time. "Additionally, we found multiple documented warnings submitted by a resident, Mr. Mark Davis, weeks before the storm. These warnings were clear, reasonable, and supported by photographic evidence. They were ignored." Every head in the room turned toward me, not with suspicion, not with annoyance, but with recognition. Some nodded. A few even muttered apologies under their breath. Cynthia's mouth fell open, her eyes widening as if she'd just seen a ghost. "That's not accurate," she stammered. "Those warnings, they weren't. Those emails." I stood and walked to the front, handing copies of my printed emails to the inspector. "These were all sent before the storm," I said. "Every timestamp matches the video files I submitted. The drain was already failing. You all saw the footage." The inspector nodded and held up the documents for the room to see. Neighbors erupted again, but this time their anger wasn't scattered. It was focused. Every voice, every accusation, every demand was aimed directly at Cynthia. "You lied to us. You blamed him to protect yourself. You put all our homes at risk. You need to step down." Cynthia's composure cracked like the glass doors of the flooded office. Her voice trembled as she tried to regain control, but the room no longer belonged to her. The board members exchanged looks, guilty, exhausted, cornered. Finally, the treasurer stood and spoke quietly but firmly. "I move to remove Cynthia Blake as HOA president effective immediately." No one argued. No one hesitated. The vote was unanimous. Cynthia sank back in her chair, eyes vacant, her power gone as swiftly as the flood had washed through her office. The meeting adjourned with murmurs of relief, anger, and tired hope. As neighbors filed out, several stopped to shake my hand or thank me. I nodded, grateful but drained. Removing her didn't erase everything she'd done. It only marked the beginning of what needed to be repaired, but even after she was gone, the damage she caused wasn't finished. Workers fixing the drainage told me something chilling. This damage didn't happen overnight, and I knew exactly who was responsible. Standing beside the open trench where the old drain had once struggled, I watched as crews pulled out rusted pipes that looked like they belonged in a scrapyard, not a modern neighborhood. Years of neglect, corrosion, and blockages poured out with every piece they removed. It was all the confirmation I didn't need but always expected. The truth had been rotting underground long before I ever moved to Maple Ridge. With Cynthia gone, the new HOA leadership moved fast. They didn't hide behind excuses or try to rewrite history. They scheduled emergency repairs, opened the financial books for homeowners to see, and publicly announced new maintenance routines. For the first time since moving in, The neighborhood felt like a community instead of a kingdom run by one person's ego. Meetings were quieter. People asked real questions. Voices were actually heard instead of silenced. And everywhere I walked, residents stopped me, not to gossip or complain, but to thank me for speaking up when no one else felt safe to. A week later, the insurance company finalized their investigation. The letter arrived in a thick envelope, but the conclusion was simple. The flooding was caused by HOA negligence, not homeowner interference, not my sandbags, not my driveway, not anything they tried to pin on me. The report specifically cited ignored maintenance, outdated drainage systems, and the board's refusal to act on documented warnings. Reading those words felt like finally breathing after weeks underwater. The truth was printed in black and white, and no amount of spin could erase it. But the fallout didn't stop there. Some board members, those who had supported Cynthia's decisions blindly, found themselves facing additional scrutiny. Questions were raised about missing maintenance logs, unapproved spending, and whether funds meant for repairs had been quietly redirected. I don't know how many investigations were opened, or how many people ended up paying fines or stepping down. But one thing was clear. This time, accountability wasn't optional. As for me, when the storm passed and the mud dried, the emotional weight hit harder than I expected. For weeks, I'd slept lightly, waiting for the next violation, the next threat, the next retaliation. It wasn't just the flooding that wore me down. It was the fear of being silenced, the pressure of fighting a system designed to punish anyone who dared to question it. But standing there watching the new drain system being installed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, not victory, not triumph, just relief. If there's one thing I want anyone watching this to take away, it's this. Document everything, every email, every notice, every odd thing you see that doesn't feel right. HOAs can be helpful, but when they go wrong, they go very wrong. And the only thing that protects you is proof. Don't let intimidation make you quiet. Don't let threats make you small. Stand your ground, even when the storm rises around you. Because sometimes, the only way to fix the damage is to expose it. And if you think this HOA was corrupt, wait until you hear what the next community did to one veteran.